My name is Preacher. I'm 80 years old, and I want to start with something that took me most of my life to understand clearly. Mastering your thoughts does not mean controlling them. It does not mean becoming someone who thinks only pure and positive and orderly thoughts. It does not mean silencing the mind through force or discipline or the accumulated willpower of a serious practice. Every one of those approaches I tried. Every one of them produced something that looked like mastery while the mind was not under pressure. And every one of them collapsed when pressure arrived. Because what I was building was not genuine mastery, it was sophisticated suppression. And suppression and mastery are not the same thing. Suppression holds the surface still, while the depths remain completely unchanged. Mastery changes the depths, and the depths are where thoughts actually come from. What I eventually came to understand is that genuine mastery of thought begins not with the thoughts themselves, but with the awareness in which the thoughts arise. That awareness, which is always present, which is aware of every thought without being any particular thought, is the ground from which genuine freedom becomes possible. And discovering that ground, stabilizing in it, learning to return to it when thought has pulled you away, is what Buddhist practice is ultimately about. Not the production of better thoughts, the discovery of what you are before any particular thought has arrived. Maybe you have found some practices that help you feel better for a while, and then found that the underlying patterns reassert themselves. Maybe you have noticed that the teachings that make sense intellectually do not always translate into genuine change in how your mind actually operates under stress. If that is your experience, stay with me, because what I want to share are not techniques for thinking better thoughts. They are genuine structural shifts in your relationship to thought itself. I was born in northern Thailand and entered the monastery as a young man, absolutely convinced that the path to mastery of my thoughts was discipline. More sitting, longer hours, stricter forms, greater willpower. I became quite disciplined in those outer senses, and for a while that felt like progress, because in comfortable conditions the disciplined mind does perform differently. It is less reactive, more measured, better at maintaining the forms of equanimity. But then something would happen that genuinely threatened what I cared about, or genuinely challenged my sense of who I was, and the disciplined performance would crack. And what came through was not a trained mind. It was the same old conditioning, sometimes wearing more sophisticated spiritual language, but functionally identical in its basic patterns to what had been there before all those years of effortful practice. You see, this is the core problem that most approaches to mastering your thoughts do not address. The thoughts are not the source of the problem. They are the symptom. The source is the conditioning that generates them. The old wounds, the adopted beliefs, the survival strategies that became habitual long before you could examine them. The deep assumptions about reality that operate below the level of any individual thought. Working at the level of the thoughts themselves, trying to change them or control them or replace them with better ones, is like trying to change the weather by rearranging the furniture. The thoughts, like the weather, are the product of conditions that lie much deeper. And here's what I didn't understand then. The teachings that actually change your relationship to thought are not teachings about how to have better thoughts. They are teachings about how to see thoughts clearly. And seeing clearly is different from thinking better. It is the development of a specific quality of awareness that can observe the arising of thought without being automatically captured by it, that can notice the interpretation forming before it has fully hardened into apparent fact, that can feel the emotion beginning to rise before it has completely taken over the whole inner space. This quality of awareness is not built through force. It is built through patient, honest, repeated practice of genuine observation. The first teaching that actually changes your relationship to thought is the understanding that you are not your thoughts. This is perhaps the most repeated statement in contemplative traditions, and the most frequently misapplied. People hear it and add it to their conceptual library as another belief to hold. But this teaching is not meant to be held as a belief. It is meant to be recognized as a direct experience. There is a difference between thinking I am not my thoughts as an idea and actually experiencing, however briefly, the gap between what thinks and what is aware of the thinking. That gap is everything. In that gap, the authority of every thought is temporarily suspended, and in that suspension, something that genuine freedom actually is becomes available. The second teaching is that all thoughts are impermanent, again, not as a belief, as a practiced observation. You sit and you watch a thought arise. You watch it stay for a moment. You watch it change. You watch it fade. You do this again and again, across many sessions, across many different kinds of thoughts, including the frightening ones, including the shameful ones, including the ones that seem most solidly true and most permanently significant. And gradually, through that observation, the nervous system begins to receive a different message than the one it usually gets. Thoughts are not permanent. They do not define you. They do not require you to act on them immediately. They come and they go, and the you that observes them does not go anywhere. That recognition, when it becomes embodied rather than merely intellectual, is one of the most stabilizing things I have ever experienced. The third teaching is the recognition that most thoughts are not about the present moment. When you begin to examine your thoughts honestly, you discover that the overwhelming majority of them are about the past or the future, replaying what happened, rehearsing what might happen, defending decisions that were already made, worrying about possibilities that have not yet arrived. The actual present moment, the only time where anything can actually be done or genuinely experienced, receives very little attention from the ordinary thinking mind. And once you see this clearly, once you genuinely recognize how rarely your thinking is about what is actually here, you become much more willing to return to the present, not as a strategy, as a recognition. Here is the only place where life is actually happening. Here is where I can actually respond rather than react. Here is where something genuinely different might become possible. You know what surprised me most about this? The present moment is almost never as bad as what the thinking mind makes of it. The thinking mind specializes in elaboration. It takes what is and adds what might be and what was and what this means and what should be done and what will happen if nothing is done. And by the time it is finished, the simple reality of the moment has become a vast and overwhelming thing. Coming back to the bare present, stripping away the elaboration, asking simply what is actually here right now, almost always produces a more manageable reality than the one the mind had constructed. The fourth teaching is working with the root rather than the branch. Every thought has an emotional root. There is something the thought is protecting or pursuing or avoiding or defending. When you find yourself caught in a recurring thought pattern, the question to ask is not, how do I stop thinking this? The question is, what feeling is underneath this thought? What does this thinking protect me from feeling directly? Fear underneath the planning, grief underneath the anger, loneliness underneath the comparison, shame underneath the self-justification. When you meet the feeling rather than continuing to follow the thought about the feeling, the thought usually loses much of its urgency. Because the thing driving it has finally been acknowledged rather than circumnavigated. The fifth teaching is the practice of welcoming rather than resisting. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive of everything I am sharing. The ordinary relationship to unwanted thoughts is to push them away, to argue with them, to suppress them, to replace them. All of those strategies share a common feature. They treat the unwanted thought as an enemy that must be defeated. And the problem with treating anything as an enemy is that enemies tend to grow in proportion to the energy you direct against them. A thought resisted often becomes more insistent than it would have been if it had been allowed to arise, be observed, and pass. Welcoming a difficult thought does not mean agreeing with it. It does not mean acting on it. It means creating enough inner space that the thought can arise without triggering an emergency response that locks it in place. What most people don't realize is that it is the resistance to a thought, far more than the thought itself, that creates the suffering associated with difficult thinking. A thought about failure, observed with genuine equanimity, passes through relatively quickly. The same thought, resisted and fought and suppressed, can dominate an entire day. The skill is not in stopping the thought. The skill is in stopping the war. The sixth teaching is learning to distinguish between thinking that serves and thinking that merely repeats. Not all thinking is created equal. Some thinking is genuinely useful. It solves real problems. It produces genuine insight. It processes real experience in ways that lead to actual understanding. But much of what the mind does is not this. Much of what the mind does is repetitive. It returns to the same themes, the same fears, the same self-justifications, the same anticipations, without producing anything new. Learning to recognize when your thinking has entered this repetitive mode and to gently interrupt it rather than following it one more time around the same circle is one of the most practical skills in the whole domain of working with thought. The seventh teaching is the development of what the Buddhist tradition calls right view. This is not about having correct opinions. It is about seeing the nature of things more accurately. Specifically, seeing that what appears as solid and permanent and fixed is actually fluid, impermanent, and constructed, including the self, including your beliefs about who you are and what you deserve and what is possible for you. These beliefs are not facts, they are stories, and once you can see them as stories, rather than as the final truth about reality, they lose the automatic authority they have been exercising over your thinking. And when they lose that authority, your thoughts become genuinely more free, not because you force them to be different, because you saw through the assumptions that were generating them. The eighth teaching is patience with the process. This is something I wish I had understood much earlier. Real change in how the mind works is slow. It does not happen in weeks or even months. It happens across years of genuine practice. And part of what is required is the willingness to practice without demanding immediate results. To plant seeds and trust that they are growing, even when nothing visible is happening above the surface. To return to practice on days when nothing seems to be changing, and on days when things seem to be getting worse, and on days when the mind is doing everything you hoped it had stopped doing. The patience itself is part of the practice. It is building something. And what it builds, over enough time, is a mind that is genuinely more free. Not because it has been forced into a better shape, because it has been genuinely seen and genuinely met and genuinely worked with, one ordinary day at a time. At 80 years old, I can tell you that my thoughts are different from what they were at 30, not because I learned to control them, because I learned to see them, and seeing them, meeting them with honesty and something approaching equanimity, allowed the underlying conditioning that generated them to gradually, slowly, imperfectly become more transparent. Not gone, transparent. And transparency in the mind is another word for freedom. Tell me in the comments what thought pattern has been most persistent in your own experience. Not to judge it, to name it, because what is clearly named is already slightly less powerful than what remains obscure. And if this message gave you something genuine to work with, stay close to this space. Because mastering your thoughts is not a project with a finish line. It is a relationship with your own mind that deepens, one honest moment at a time, for as long as you are willing to keep returning.